Welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. We are found on Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and all your favorite podcast hangouts. And of course, this is Wine Talks, where we peel back the wine business one bottle, one cork, and one label at a time. And always sponsored by the original Wine of the Month Club, supporting the new Pure Wine Club, where we send you organic and biodynamic wines to your door. But we have a returning guest, and this is kind of fun because A, I get to chase new vintages of these wines, and two, we get to peel it back a little bit more. You may have heard him on a previous video. This is Gary Lipp from the Coho Wines. Was it Coho Winery?
No, Coho Wines.
Coho Wines, right?
Yeah, we do not have a winery. We make our wines.
We do not have a winery.
No, I've always made it at Friends Wines.
Well, what am I going to do? I have no guest quarters to go to, or no.
Well, we'll take care of you. You can stay in my son's old room.
Oh, okay, great. With the pictures of the race cars on the wall. Okay,
that's right, exactly. No, race car bed.
Yeah. Oh, is it? Thank you for being here, Gary. It's always great to see you again, and I appreciate you coming in this afternoon and having a chat about wines because, this. First of all, your wines are gorgeous, and I was trying to peel back a little bit when we were off camera about when you started this thing, what got you into this? Why would you want to do this? We know how difficult it is. It's even getting more crazy. So tell me back, what vintage is this, by the way, for Coho Wines?
This is our 18th vintage.
18. Oh, it is. Okay,
yeah.
It's a long time. That's actually long tenure in the wine business.
Yeah, not too bad.
Not too bad, right?
But I always worked for people that had some longevity. I started in Joe Heitz's cellar, and
really?
Then a long time with Robert Mondavi, and so I've the Chapelet family.
All the originals, right?
Right, exactly. So I was fortunate to learn a lot from those people, and probably the most important lesson was if you're going to be in the wine business, to take the long view. This is not a short-term business, and you're dealing with an agricultural product, and you need to respect the time cycles with that and not be in a hurry. Let Mother Nature help tell you what to do.
Well, there's something interesting about what you did. And I don't want to go too fast.
Sure.
I want to go back to those days because my dad started his business in his bug happened in the 50s when he read an article in the Times about Dwight Eisenhower serving the Queen of England the Charles Krug Special Select 58 or something, right? It's 56. And then he came to the wine shop in the 60s, late 60s, and it became one of the great wine shops in Southern California, where Bruce Nyer was bringing wines to him, and Dave Stair didn't even know what selling wine was like, and Jim Bear was in that. So you go into that time frame. When did you start working with Joe Heitz and those guys?
Well, I started working with Joe in 81, but I was a retailer and a restaurant and working in restaurants starting in the mid 70s. So
you were there.
Yeah, I was there. So all of those people. Well, I grew up in Cleveland.
Ah, okay.
And that's where those experiences happened.
Okay, so this is interesting. I've never had this conversation. So here's somebody that was working in the food and beverage industry in the 70s when California wine hit the world's map, right, with the Taste of Paris. What was happening in Cleveland when it came to the beverage scene?
Well, actually, Cleveland was always a fairly progressive wine town,
really?
And they were very open to California. They liked what was happening. It's interesting. Of course, they'd been growing wine on the shores of Lake Erie since the 1840s, but Lambrusco fruit.
Erie, yeah. Great appellation.
But starting in the late 60s, early 70s, there were people who were mostly growing French hybrids, but some vinifera fruit, and making interesting wines whenever they could. There was a crazy ear, nose, and throat surgeon who had a very good French restaurant and used to make wine in the basement of the restaurant, and I used to help him. So that was my first opportunity to get my hands dirty.
Wow. Okay. So I want to just define vitis vinifera for the listeners. Vitis vinifera is the wines, the Latin classification for wine grapes, the top level, right? So
they're the European varietals that we know. So people the people who were trying their hand at it in Northeast Ohio back in the day, they'd have some success with Riesling and Chardonnay. Too humid to do any serious red grapes at the time.
That's probably still the case, right?
Yeah, I mean, the humidity hasn't changed, but maybe they've adapted in some ways. I don't know. But mostly it was combinations, what we would call French hybrids, combination that mostly were developed in Canada in the 1920s. And they were had the hardiness of the native Lambrusca
the
fruit,
Lambrusca, right?
And
sure.
then a little bit of the finesse of the vinifera fruit.
So I got in big trouble one year when I did I was going to feature a Concord grape wine from Kentucky, and it was an interesting story actually because I went to buy it from the guy and he says, "Well, I can't sell it to you." I said, "Why not?" He goes, "Well, I don't make enough." He says, "Because we're restricted in Kentucky in how much we can ferment. Of course, you can distill as much as you want." Right. But so he had, he amongst all probably Vitis Lambrusco wines, which is the second level, the Latin classification of grapes, Concord and Thompson, stuff like that. So he couldn't sell me the wine, but I thought that was fascinating that you could distill as much bourbon as you want, but there's no classification. But the point was, when I did an email, and I can't remember what the point was when I made the comment in the body of the text that said, "We have no indigenous grapes in America to make wine." And I had a lot of emails from customers saying, no, you don't understand. We have these other grapes like Concord. I'm like, well, okay, we have no Vitis vinifera grapes that are indigenous to us. So here you are, you're trying to get into this business. You're with Joe Heitz. You worked in the food and beverage industry. Why did you come to California?
Well, it was evident that if I wanted to make my life in it, I wanted to be where it was happening.
Where it was happening.
Yeah.
Is it Cleveland? That's just fascinating. Are they still sort of a cutting edge beverage and food place?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, food, everyone in the country outside of Chicago and New York are behind California. But, but in the wine part of it, they're fairly progressive.
I wonder, there's, my daughter just earned, my listeners are probably tired of hearing this, but they just earned a Michelin star last 2 weeks ago at the restaurant she works at in New York. Is Michelin there? Do you know, in Cleveland?
I don't know that there's any Michelin-starred restaurants there. But there are certainly, I'd say there's 25 restaurants
really good,
that take it seriously and are creative and use fresh ingredients and try and bring, make something
and the
special.
wine lists are...
The wine lists are very good.
Yeah.
That's certainly something that has been since the mid-'70s an important part of the better Cleveland restaurants.
Oh, that's interesting. So you came to California. You thought this was an interesting idea. Now, I would agree, so to speak, that at that time, the career of California wines is probably a very exciting time to come. You're at the precipice of what's going to be a great American product, a California product for at least. And what did you do?
I worked in the cellar. But
you went right to Joe Heitz?
Yeah, well, what happened was I was coming out here. I had spent the early part of the 70s as a ski bump in Steamboat Springs, Colorado.
Oh, okay.
and that's the first place I got familiar with wine. I won't say I was in the wine business then, but, selling.
Yeah, I get it. All right. So.
Yeah. So anyhow, they came out to my best friend's wedding to be his best man. And, and when he left on his honeymoon, my wife and I were left with their apartment and little car. And I had made appointments in Napa. I had written to my 10 favorite wineries. There were only 30 some at the time.
At the time, yeah.
And 3 responded. So I had an appointment in Mondavi, which is nice. And they said, well, this was in August of 81. And they said, write us next spring, maybe we could use you as a tour guide. And I had an appointment at Freemark Abbey. Larry Langford was the winemaker at the time. Very nice. We sat out in the parking lot on a rock. He shared his brown bag lunch with me and told me what life was like in Napa, but he didn't have anything. and then I had an appointment with Joe.
Okay,
and
that's funny.
Timing is everything. And it was going to be an early harvest, and one of his cellar workers, he only had 3. Had quit a couple weeks before. So we talked for about 15 minutes, and he said to me, can you start tomorrow? And my heart
kind
is
of busy,
racing. Well, what I did say was, I hate to ask for my first day off, but I'm here with my wife.
Oh, that's funny.
And I said, I could start on Thursday, and but let me have a day with my wife in San Francisco, and I'll drop her off at the airport. She can take the red eye back to Cleveland.
Okay, that's funny.
And then he famously said to me, I suppose you don't have a place to stay, do you? And I said, well, no.
Not really.
And he said, well, you can bunk here with Alice and me. So my first 8 weeks in Napa Valley, I lived at the Heights Ranch
Wow.
at the end of Taplin Road, and it was a really wonderful experience.
That's got to be a pretty unique
Yeah.
experience. I mean, that didn't happen all the time, and here you are at the right time, and you probably felt bad you're sending your wife home to Cleveland, and you're going to be alone. I mean, that's an amazing story. So, despite the technology in the sense of like we have digital sorting tables for grapes and all those kind of things, the root technology of making wine from the day that you were with Heights Cellars, making Bella Oaks or Fay Vineyards or whatever you were making then, and today, is it that much different as far as the absolute process?
No, I mean, if you want to spend the money on the bells and whistles, but still, as far as I'm concerned, 85% of what's in the glass happens in the vineyard,
Right.
and that doesn't change. Yes, now, I shouldn't say that doesn't change, because certainly since that time in 81, Napa has adapted quite a bit, and phylloxera in the late 80s spurned that change. So people had to replant vineyards, and they began to use better techniques, better trellising, more open canopies. Clonal choices became more important, and so the winemaking did evolve. But still, it's planting it, letting Mother Nature take care of it, and making sure that you're doing the right things when you pick up the clues from Mother Nature as to what positive or negative could be going on.
It's an interesting point. We were at Hess, and we saw this sorting table where it's like digitally throwing out the grapes that are not ready, whatever they're doing.
The optical.
Yeah, the optical one. And it's like, and then we have this not new, but this phenolic ripeness concept, which is sort of this whole grape idea. And I always think back to some of the earliest days. They just found, they found a winery 2 years ago in Armenia, or 5 years ago, that's 6,000 years old. And what conversations they were having, or women too, of course, around the amphora, as to what was happening with their wines. And I suppose it's changed from there, but when it comes down to it, what's coming out of the ground, and let's not screw it up.
Right, exactly.
Right? But then we move these wines are well crafted, and they, we were talking about the expression, for instance, in the Merlot, is just so unique because of where it's from. And if we can all get wines that are expressive of where they're grown, and the hands are out of it, right? But if you take that even further, and this new biodynamic movement, well, not new, it's been around since the 30s, but the biodynamic movement in wine where it's so rustic that it's almost unpleasant anymore. And clearly these wines are beautifully crafted, and they're very expressive, and you can be very expressive and not have to squish the grapes with your feet, right?
Right, exactly.
Because
I think, first of all, we as a paragon of winemaking, growing up in the 70s, we always thought about the great French wines or great Italian wines as being, the where you want to go. And then realizing, well, California, we have our advantage is we have this beautiful ripeness, and we can, and develops more flavor more easily. And in a way, what you really want is to be able to take that elegance that we associate with European wines and vitality, good acidity, and join that with the richness. Don't run away from the richness of what California is, but don't overdo it.
Right.
And I think that's how kind of my guiding principles on trying to make wines that are going to be balanced and supple and go pretty well with the dinner table, because that's the most important thing to me. I like to eat,
that's what it
and
comes down
I
to.
want a good glass of wine to make it all the better.
So this is the 18th vintage of Coho, and we bought some last time you were in, and we used it actually. I was very happy to do it this way because we have a client, and they deliver wine. They wanted a very expensive case of wine to introduce their clients to their services, and I used the Merlot and your Meritage for that, your blend. So here are these young athletes that are signed onto this group, receiving some of these wines, and they're so expressive of where they're from that that's what we want, and we have more of this coming forward. So I'm glad you brought in the new vintages. But all these are farmed by other people, and are you part of this process?
Well, sure. I mean, I work with people who know what they're doing.
Yes, they've been doing it for a while.
Yeah, they've been doing it for a while, and with the exception, the only bigger grower that I work with is for the Stanley Ranch, and they're great farmers, so I have no problem with it. But everyone else I work with, they live on their properties. They're farmers. Some, not all of their careers, but most of them have been, this is what they were born to do, and they have little plots in Napa, and I get some or all of their fruit. And, at the end of the day, I'm their customer.
Right.
So we have a meeting of the minds, and we're checking in the vineyards throughout the growing season, see how things are going, and discussing any issues that we may see are happening, and with a suggestion. And they're going to come back to me and say, right, we can do that. Or, I know this vineyard.
Yeah, right.
And it's, and as I say, it's a meeting of the minds.
Well, they're beautiful. So you were able to then in 2000, what are we talking about now? 2001?
Yeah, two.
Okay. 2002, facility you don't have. You make them.
I guess this is my 17th vintage. Sorry.
Something that I think the public may or may have grasp of, like my license. I have a license to make wine. It hangs at a place called Sonoma 980, which is a large co-op. But you have your license hanging somewhere, but you control everything that goes on there. The grapes come in. They're on a truck. They go right to the crusher, the stemmer.
Right.
And you're there.
Right, we're there. You like to show up at the pick. Very rarely, I've yet to have two different vineyards pick on the same day.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
So we're able to manage.
Is that because you have different sources of? Obviously, yes. Caneros is in the south
right,
part of Napa,
but I have different growers, and so not everything ripens at the same time.
Yeah,
and we used to work with a property up on Diamond Mountain, and so that always used to come in.
Really?
Last.
Yeah, last, right. That's great. That's so interesting. Mm-hmm. So you the grapes come in. You're gonna destem them, crush them.
Right.
Out comes the juice.
Yeah, and then we actually they might even depending what I make my wine at a friend's winery, and depending how busy they are, we may just put dry ice on the fruit. And he may not be able to, get to him until the next day.
Didn't know that was a process.
Yeah, and it just keeps everything where it is.
Keeps it right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then once we will crush them and put them in the fermenter, and then we will lower the temperature, and we'll let them cold soak for 5 to 7 days.
And that's the full fermentation is about 5 to 7 days.
Well, this is prior to the fermentation.
Before you.
So we lower the temperature so that
it won't ferment.
So that it won't ferment.
Yeah.
And we're just letting it rest. I really like to think of the grapes as kind of marathon runners. And they've gone through this, this 26 miles of turning in, to the container holding this amazing potential elixir.
Yeah.
And by letting them rest for a few days before you really fire them up again and put them through further paces, you let them rest.
Yeah, a little rest, a little cold jacket on there.
So that's what we do. And then we'll raise the temperature up. And we don't do naturally occurring fermentations. I did a few when we first started, but I found them too inconsistent. Mm. But I work with, some yeast cultures that are... I think are really wonderful and do a great job, and I'm always sure that my fermentations are going to go complete.
Well, I think that's one of the risks of natural fermentation is that the yeast doesn't seem to be as strong. They can arrest itself.
Exactly.
You come into problems, and these are very vibrant and expressive wines, and I think a lot of public and I think a lot of wine people will consider that if you don't use native yeast, you can't get this freshness and this brightness and this wonderful expression. I don't think that's accurate at all.
No. And actually, it's the next step where I think Coho is more old school and why we're able to keep that freshness and that vitality. What really became pop, so after the wine is done going through fermentation, for red wines anyhow, you will leave the wine in contact with the skins and seeds for a certain period of time. This is called a post-alcoholic extended maceration. Mm-hmm. And what you're doing is you're pulling color and varietal character and tannin into the wine. And starting in about the early 90s, people began to play with, well, if some is good and more is better, maybe a real lot is really good. And these extended macerations began to go 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and they would develop wines with a lot of what I like to call muscle and density. Well, those wines are a style that I'm not interested in making. Now, I'm not saying they don't make good wines, but they're not the kind of wines I want to make. I want things that where their acidity comes through, where they're, I like to use the word supple and balanced. So we at Coho are pulling all of our wines off the skins and seeds 6 to 8 days, and I really think that helps keep that.
I think you're right.
And
the complexity is still there. And
I get all the character I want.
Yeah.
All the flavor I want.
Plenty of character. I don't have to worry about that.
Exactly. And I'm not building this. I'm not making a cocktail wine.
Yeah. Right. Well, there's been coming through here. I get so much stuff. I mean, it's pretty absurd, some of it, and some of it, they relish in its rusticness, and I'm sure you're of the same thought process I am, and I want to enjoy something I'm drinking. I don't want to have to sort of make an excuse for it as if, well, this is natural, so it's better for me, or whatever the term natural means doesn't mean anything really. But not criticizing the wines, because as an academic exercise, in fact, there was a group in yesterday, and they asked if they could go visit a friend of mine who's a buyer at we had lunch today. I mean, the buyer there. I called him. I said, this is not for you. You're not going to serve this at the restaurant, but you need to taste them, because as an exercise, an academic exercise in winemaking, it's an important thing these days.
I agree, and I'm of the opinion I have tasted some what termed as natural wines that are science experiments,
right.
And others and others that are really beautiful wines.
Yeah.
And I think that the ones that I tend to like, the winemakers seem to be respecting the grape,
yes,
and not trying to change it,
right.
And
but it's like I've had biodynamic wines from Sardinia, gorgeous Sangiovese, and except for that little edge of youth and freshness that's just slightly different than conventionally made wines. I would have known the difference, because the fruit character was there. And this, I think my listeners have heard this before, it's the guy that plays music in his vineyard. He plays Bach. In fact, one of the comments is, I have bows. I have a complete bow system in my vineyard. And so that's pretty biodynamic. It's very expensive, because you have only so many, you have to have so many workers per row to make sure each vine, because there's nothing, you can't do anything to it, is being handled properly. And each vine almost has to be separately canopied, because it's its own little thing going on, because it's biodynamic. And I think that's interesting, and I think the wines were gorgeous, and I would drink them every day if I could afford them. But some of these experiments, you're right, they're almost experiments, and they're on their 5th, 7th, 10th vintage, and they're at these wine shops like Silver Lake Wine, which is a great shop. But my daughter bought one my daughter, who knows I have 40,000 bottles in the warehouse, comes home with a $28 bottle of rosé that was undrinkable.
Yeah.
In contemporary. This is an 18, and everything was going on with it. So I think that this is the conventionally made wines, as expressive as yours are, where I want to land when I'm drinking a glass of wine.
There's a lot of approaches, and I've always appreciated that every winemaker has their own vision of how they want to do it.
Right.
And the Coho's just happens to be that, as I say, I like to make wines that my friends and I and family sit down at the dinner table. The wine goes down really well, and the conversations follow.
Right.
So,
well, isn't that what wine's about? I
yes.
mean,
well, that was what I really learned from Bob Mondavi.
Yeah.
More than anything else. Well, I learned a lot from Bob Mondavi.
When you went from Joe Heights, we got off track here. We went to Joe Heights, and you were there for how long?
Just about a year and a half.
Oh, well, that's a pretty good time. And then you looking for something else to do?
Well, I wanted to, I needed sales and marketing experience. Right. I wanted to know this side of the business, and my wife was working at Mondavi, and there was an internal job posted to be the rep in the city of San Francisco, and they were looking for someone with restaurant and retail wine experience and winery experience. Mm-hmm. So I said, that's me.
Yeah, how about that?
And it was great, because I got wonderful opportunities. I became had a few early jobs, and then they decided that it was time to Robert Mondavi to go to Europe, and I became the first export director. And my family and I lived in London for 5 years. And
did you know the language when you got there?
Kind of. Some of it. I'm still learning what aluminium is.
Yeah, aluminium, right.
But more importantly, Angelo Gaia was my importer in Italy.
Really?
To travel Italy with the Pope.
That's amazing.
Was amazing.
Yeah.
And Angelo and his wife would come every summer to London and take 6 weeks of an English inversion class.
Yes, right.
And so we would see them during that time period. And Patrick Ladoucette from Chateau de Noisy was our importer in France.
That's phenomenal.
So the doors that got open to me professionally and personally because of Bob Mondavi, I could never thank him enough. And
he was a special guy.
He
He used
really
to come
was.
down and help my dad with his Les Amis d'Avant meetings. I think I told this story to somebody else, but my wife and I were in New York. This was a few weeks ago, and we were headed home, and there was a woman in a wheelchair, and she was in line at Starbucks right by the JetBlue terminal, and my wife engaged her in a conversation. And my wife says, "What do you do?" She says, "Well, we're in the wine business." And my wife's like, "Oh, that's great. We Wine of the Month Club, they're pretty proud about the conversation." And the woman says, "Well, I'm Robert Mondavi's daughter." Marcia, I think her name is.
Yeah.
And then the conversation was even better. So
Right.
She ended up coming around at the gate next to ours, and I went to talk to her. I said, "Your dad helped my dad on a couple of projects, and we've been doing this for a long time as well, and we just so nice to meet you." She says, "Oh, please come up when you come to the winery, come see us, or when you come to Napa." And I said, "I want to start Les Amis d'Avant again," in my dad's sort of honor, because it was that academic, consumer-based wine appreciation group. And they held tastings, and Bowser was there, and I think Robert Mondavi came a couple times, and even Jim Barrett at that time. So it's a close family, and if you had the training, your background with Heights and Mondavi, and then the guy, and this is an amazing history to be in this business.
I was very fortunate. And I think. That's why what I really learned, and even all these were really big personalities, their wine was always the most important thing to them, not who they were.
Right. Yeah.
And so for me, I'm just really happy that I'm making wines that people enjoy. When I get an email or sometimes even a phone call from someone saying, or a text message with a bottle at their dinner table saying, "Oh, we are enjoying this so much," nothing makes me feel better.
That's great.
Yeah.
So after the Mondavi experience, so when was that? About the 80 something?
Yeah. So I finished there, and I left in early '93, and I went to the Chalone Group, and I became the head of sales and marketing for them for a couple of years, and then Jess Jackson kind of swayed me away. Money talks.
This is like an anthology of the greatest names in the business.
And Jess wanted to. He was starting something he was calling Artisans and Estates, and it was his smaller wineries. And he had just bought the Robert Pepe winery, and he wanted to transition Cardinal, which was his high-end KJ brand, into its own winery. I think he always wanted it to be Opus 2.
Yeah.
And so for a couple of years, I did all the marketing. I had other people working with me, but I was the head of it, and we did all the small winery marketing. I also got to be the team member as Jess was plotting out the future, and for all of his growth, I was the marketing, and he was one smart guy.
Somebody pricks you with a pin and you bleed. You're bleeding wine Napa history. It's phenomenal stuff. And Chalone and
and then I hooked up with someone from my early Mondavi days, Paul Hobbs.
Oh,
and
really? Wow, that's another name that.
Yeah. So Paul, when I went to work with Paul, he had already established himself as a really good Chardonnay and Pinot producer. But Paul saw that the money was in Napa Cab, and I came along at the right time. I mean, it was myself and Paul, 2 winemakers, and an office person. So it was a small company.
Very beginning.
Yeah, he was making wine in Argentina, and we started the import company and making those wines.
What was that brand?
The Vinha Cobos, and then the Felino wines.
Right.
And so that was a lot of fun. And it was during that time period, the last year I was with Paul, that I started Coho.
Oh, so you were
So
still
I was so I was still with him, and then I had one other chance to work with a great family, and that was, you may recall the last time we talked, I told you that we were unfortunately in 2005 caught up in that warehouse fire at Mare Island. So Coho was out of business for a few years, and the Chapelet family took me in. And
there's another royalty.
Really, and some of the nicest people I have ever been associated with. I mean, I've loved everybody I've worked with in the wine business, but what I think maybe, and I don't mean to be knocking the Heitzes or the Mondavis or any of them, because they were all wonderful, but what I appreciated the most about the Chapelets, they were family. They certainly had their internal issues,
of course,
but somehow they were able to keep it out of the workplace.
Well, it's not a book like all the rest of those families turn into, right?
Exactly.
Actually,
you were never asked to pick sides.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That's fair, because I had a brother and sister here the other day, and I'm like, wow, how do you do that? I'd never worked with my sister. And then I had another gentleman from Italy, and he's working with his father-in-law. I'm like, how do you do that? That's phenomenal. But this Paul Hopkins is really interesting to me. He just finished the vintage of wine, maybe on their second vintage in Armenia. And Gaspar will tell you about this Jacobian Hobbs project. It was great wines, kind of the beginning of, when you said that Napa had 30 wineries at the time when you started there, Armenia has 27 when they became free, and now they have 54, and it seems to be growing. But Paul Hobbs had interest in this terroir to go out there and according to the Jacobian family, which I trust, said he wanted his name on the label. And then comes now this whole new genre of wines. Just a very fascinating guy.
Yeah, Paul's a really smart guy. He's a scientist and loves the land. I mean, he grew up, his father was a farmer. He grew up on a farm. And so he has that innately in him. And then with this uber curious mind of his. And also, he likes going places and
he's been going all over, that's for sure.
That's for sure. And helping people and making a little money while he's
apparently he put his hand in the dirt in one part of Armenia, the Ararat Valley, and said, I don't think so. And they went to another, I don't remember which part. You know what part it is that they ended up with the Jacobian? In the south, and smell the dirt.
That was the spot. Huh?
I think I can make wine here.
I'm not. It wouldn't surprise me one bit.
When you brought the Chapelet, is interesting. They actually, when I started here, this is probably 88 or 89. The wife came and made a sales call on me. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she came down, or the daughter.
The daughter. He had 3 daughters, and one lived in L.A., the middle daughter.
And I thought how cool she's willing to...
Or maybe the youngest daughter. But anyhow, she still lives in Southern California.
She came out and she made a sales call on me, and I kind of feel like I caught the tail end of some of this Napa royalty with the company. My dad was definitely ingrained with it, but I was able to catch some of this as times changed. So,
well, we were you kind of alluded to it earlier in the conversation. You said Bob Mondavi helped your dad.
Yeah.
Well, they all helped each other.
Yeah.
And Bob was a big part of that. I think he understood innately that it wouldn't be enough just for Robert Mondavi to make good wines. You need more people making good wines so the consumer understands, there's really something going on here, rather than it's an anomaly.
Do you think that you could start this today? The price of everything.
Yeah, no, it would be
without some kind of track record or some kind of
you'd need
resource
you'd
or a lot of money.
Yeah, you'd need venture capitalists to say, this Paul Hobbs kid, he's pretty smart. He can stick his hand in the dirt and know where it
figure
works.
It out.
But it would be very, very difficult in today's prices for these things to happen.
On the direct-to-consumer side, it changes every day, as you probably know. And recently, I just heard that one of my competitors, which was a venture capitalized company, actually the darling of sort of, if I'm in this guy's shoes that sold the company back in the day when he sold it, I'm like a hero. I'm like a genius, because he got way more than it would have been worth. And now they're trying to get out of it. It hasn't been that long that the venture capitalists realized this is just not that profitable.
Right.
And the return, they want to know how fast can they get their money back and how much they're going to get back when they get it. And the wine business is not the place for that metric.
No, it's not. Well, if you even go back to the early 70s, look at Coca-Cola. Someone must have said, hey, we ought to get in the wine business, and they sent out their marketing guys, and they had a good plan.
Yeah.
They bought Sterling, and they said that'll be the high end for us.
Well, they had Taylor too, right?
All right, and they bought, and in the middle they bought Monterey
Yeah,
Vineyards.
Monterey, yeah, that's right.
And then on the low end they bought the Taylor name from New York, because people would know that back east. But they bought the Franzia family's properties, and so what had been Franzia became Taylor, California. And what the figure I always heard was after a number of years, and they had made, on a $22 million investment, they had made nothing, exactly. And someone said, geez, $22 million, if that had been all invested in syrup, what would we have made?
Sure.
And the next day they were out of it.
That's so interesting.
Ublind, the same thing.
Yeah.
It's not a get-rich-quick business.
No.
I mean, you look at the wealthy people who have come into the wine business, whether they're buying a beautiful estate in Santa Rita Hills or in Napa Valley or in Chalk Hill Road, wherever it is. Yes, the real value is in the land they're buying, because that there isn't that much great vineyard land.
I had Chris Corley in here. He's like, yeah, my dad, he says, I ran into the family who my father bought the land from in 1976, and they're like, gee, worst mistake we ever made in our lives.
Yeah, exactly. But as far as the ability to make money selling the wine, even if you're getting $400 or $500 a bottle,
it's still hard.
It's very difficult.
So you've said two things that I want to pick up on. One was the Coca-Cola thing. Gaspar may know this or may not. My wife's uncle invented the spoon straw and the flexi straw. His name was Art Iconian, very well-known inventor, masters at MIT mechanical engineering. Simple, great guy, but figured out a way to make the spoon straw and this flexi straw. He sold to Coca-Cola. And that time they're at Sterling. He says, well, they took us to Sterling and we stayed the weekend and we went over their wines, and then we went to Taylor and we did all this stuff. And so his job, and this is 1985 at the time, was to create a machine that would assemble the bar cap of a Taylor Cellars 1.5 with a synthetic cork. Now, 85. This is long before, what's his name started, St. Francis started using it, and Barefoot Cellars. This is long before that. And they had a beautiful cork, and he made a machine that would glue them together, and that was the bar cap. When they sold the company, which must have been around that time, like 87, 88, that Coca-Cola got out. I don't remember what it was.
It was actually a little before that.
A little before that. Yeah. Okay, so they abandoned everything. And he and I found, and this is 1990, we found the equipment in a warehouse in El Monte. And we went to inspect it, and it still had plastic, virgin plastic in the hopper, and the cork machine, everything was great. So he and I were going to resurrect this machine, start making proper synthetic corks, because at that time the corks were not very good.
Right,
they're better now.
They put an off-putting smell on the
So
wine.
I made a deal with Coke, and it was a royalty-only deal. I was going to pick up the machines, move to a friend of mine's warehouse that had a plastic bag manufacturing plant, and then we realized it was like $1 million probably just to get it started. But it was a fascinating cork, and this guy was so brilliant. He and I went to Ontario. I can't remember the name of the company, and they were making the first synthetic corks, and they were softer. And I called Mike Houlihan at Barefoot, and he was using them. And I said, what do you think? He goes, well, they're okay, but they tend to bend going into the thing. You want to know why they bent? I took my uncle to Ontario to look at the machine. We get out of the office, we get in the car. He goes, it'll never work. I go, why? He goes, that's a shoe soling machine. That's an Italian machine made for shoe soles. He goes, I guarantee you that the cell structure of the cork in the middle of the cork is too large to support any pressure. On the edges, it's more firm because the temperature of the plastic going to the outer molds is inconsistent.
Right.
So what we do, we cut the cork open, and you look at it, and that was right on. But this guy was brilliant. You said something else I thought was really interesting, and it's a great book called Tangled Vines. Have you heard of this book?
Sure.
So Francis Jekenspiel, it's about Mark Anderson and the guy that burned your wine up.
Yes, exactly.
I think he's still in jail. Right?
I hope so. I wouldn't be disappointed if that's the case. It's funny when after he had been arrested, and they waited about 2 years. I mean, they were building the case. They
Yes.
knew it was him within weeks.
Crazy guy.
But, and he was sitting in jail. I was getting notices from the Justice Department, and they wanted to know whether I want to make statements at his sentencing. And, well, yes, I do.
Hell yeah, I do.
And it just kept getting put off and put off. Well, just a quick story. This was the origin of our headwaters. That happened in the middle of harvest in 2005, and Coho lost everything we had.
So you were sending everything there? Is that where you stored your wines at that time?
Well, everything that was bottled. So what they had was the bottled the previous summer, the 2003 Napa Cabernet, and the 2004 Stanley Ranch Pinot Noir.
Yeah,
now, there was a little bit, there was 20, 30 cases of the previous vintages of both of those also, but so it was about 1,000 cases, and it was now what we had in barrel, luckily at my friend's winery, were the 04 Napa Cabernet and the 2 new vineyards we had picked up, the Michael Black Vineyard Merlot and the Summit Vine Ranch Cabernet. So those were,
they're in barrel.
They're in barrel. So that gave me I'm gonna make this work. I've got some pretty damn good wines there, and somehow we'll make it happen. And that's when I took the job I tried something else first. I worked for a Spanish importer for a little while, but then ended up with the Chapelets till I got back on my feet.
So there was the gap there. Okay, good.
But so what happened though, and this is interesting. This Michael Black Merlot vineyard had actually been a Paul Hobbs vineyard, and it was really special. Right on the other side of the same hill I live on. So I would sugar sample it. I'd go on the pick every year and got to know Michael fairly well. And anyhow, without getting into that whole long story, that's for another podcast. This was a really special Merlot vineyard, and it was the most expensive fruit I was buying at the time, even more expensive than my Cabernet.
Really?
Because Coombsville at the time was a bargain.
And Merlot was still,
And on this Merlot vineyard in particular, he could get a premium for it.
Yeah.
So normally this vineyard produces 6-8 tons. I think maybe one year with Paul, we picked 11 tons. Well, in 2005, long, cool growing season, and I have no money, it threw 17 tons of the most expensive fruit.
And your contract was with the whole thing.
Yeah, and I didn't want to lose it.
Yeah, of course.
And Michael was great. We worked out terms. He lowered the price on some of the excess fruit, and that was okay. But in the meantime, I had this new Cabernet vineyard up on Diamond Mountain, and I wanted to keep that, so I'm scrambling for money. So I had to go to my Napa Coombsville Cabernet grower, and I was only going to get his fruit for one more year because he and his wife had started a brand. And I'm going to mention his name now because sadly he just passed away about 2 weeks ago. But he was a real gentleman, Paul Maroon. And I went to him and said, Paul, I'm broke, and we were going to pick in a couple of weeks, and I don't have any money. We're wiped out. And he said, I'll keep the fruit because we're building a brand and happy to do that. And he said, but let me give you a ton of Cabernet for free. And a friend of ours,
give me a ton of. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, it was a big vintage, and
still.
And our friend Ernie Weir from Hungoffen Winery gave us a ton of Cabernet for free. So at the end of the day, I declassified about 60% of the Michael Black Merlot vineyard, those 2 tons of Cabernet that these people had generously given us, and created a new wine called Headwaters, and it's my red blend.
So you have to thank Mark Anderson for that.
Well, exactly. And it turned out to be a big success for us, and the second and third vintages of it got very high scores in the Spectator and was in the top 19. It was number 19 in the top 100. So the longer it took for his sentencing, and I'm keep getting this notice, I'm going, am I going to have to go there and thank this guy?
Now that's a funny story. He came all the way around. I just for the listeners, the Tangled Vines, which they've heard about the book, and I've spoken to Francis a couple times on the phone. This Mark Anderson guy was sort of a crazy guy, and he had set up this collecting and distribution warehouse. It was old. I forgot the previous use of the warehouse, but it's a brilliant idea, really.
Well, I mean, it was someone who was who, my understanding is, it was somebody, you know, because of direct shipping laws, and that was the height of, you know, wineries losing their licenses and this and that. It was a company that had said, well, we'll take your wine and we'll get it to you gray market somehow, but we'll keep them here in temperature controlled warehouse. Well, it went out of business, and Mark bought all the wine.
That's right.
And my understanding was what he did was he opened up all the boxes and took out all the good wines and put crap in there and sold the good ones, and then sent people these wines and says, well, I don't know, that was what was in the box.
He did do that.
That's my understanding.
In fact, there were people that were coming to get their wine when the blank started to hit the fan, and people like you were coming back to get your wines before he burned it down. They were opening the cases and finding Glenelg Chardonnay and stuff like that.
Exactly.
And it was a big problem, but it was such a psychotic story. And Francis did an amazing job of taking the wine trade from 1750 in Cucamonga, moving it to Napa, and the story and the murder and the fraud and all the rest that goes in between. Because when I say that to people, I go, yeah, the books about murder, fraud, arson, you know, in the wine business, they're like, what? You know?
Right, and the best we could do for TV was Falcon Crest.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so much better stories. So just one last funny note on that. About 5 years ago, little vineyard in Coombsville that I worked with got sold. And I get a call, and the guy says, hi, Gary, I want to introduce myself to you, but please don't hang up the phone. My name is Mark Anderson. But I'm the good. I want you to think of me as the good Mark Anderson. And he bought this vineyard, and it's a major component of the headwaters.
Oh, that's so funny that he's walking around having to excuse his name to everybody.
And for the first couple of years, whenever he would call, he'd say, Gary, it's the good Mark.
Okay, that's hilarious. It's a sad story, and it's an interesting story. I'm going to have Frances on the podcast next time she's in L.A. In fact, she's the one that encouraged me to get my dad's story down about how this DTC market started in 1972 with this club, and she says, you got to get this story down. So I hired an investigative reporter from LA Times, a friend of ours, and he went down to my dad's house in La Jolla and the last few months ago and just started recording conversations and his trek from Egypt to here and the ideas behind. Really, it was a fluke. We do not have 1% or even 0.5% of the total marketplace, even though it was his idea. So it's unfortunate.
Right. Yes, right.
So we're still selling wine, but it's been fascinating again. And I forgot, you know, I don't get to play all these podcasts back or watch the videos over again. And you have a fascinating history in this industry. It's kind of like this little history book. You really ought to sit down past this podcast and sort of plot out the parallel story of the wine trade and how it relates to your trek through it, because it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I had a mentor at Robert Mondavi. Yeah. He was kind of the dean of wine public relations. His name was Harvey Posert, and he started off as a legitimate press. Well, first he had been at the end of the Second World War. He had been in the OSS. You know, the early, the precursor to the CIA. And he was a really smart guy. And then he went into journalism, and he was the press person for the Wine Institute. And,
oh, really? Yeah,
yes.
Okay.
And Bob Mondavi met him there. And someone who was on Bob's board said, get this guy. Anyhow, he became a good friend of mine up, for 30 years until he passed away. And he always said, got some good stories. You ought to put them down. So one of these days, I will do it.
Well, if you need to come down and do this again, we'll do it again.
Well, it sounds great, Paul. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Big fun.
Take care.